So Professor Anton turned me on to this video of a lecture by the philosopher Alexander Bard, who, aside from being a philosopher, is also a sociologist of the internet, and he's written several really well-selling books about the topic. And he's an arrogant guy, but brilliant also. He's talking about what has been called sin theism. The idea that sort of there is a viable form of theism nowadays, but it is a synthetic variety, which is to say that um, it is a theism in which God is created, where God is a creature just like the rest of us, and that human beings relate to this God in what I would call a co-creative way, um, and watch the video. It's very interesting. I'm actually only about 30 minutes into it, so I'm only responding to half of it. I'm not entirely sure where he's going, where Bard's going to end up here. It's going to have something to do with the internet being God, the created God that he's talking about. But so far, what he's done is sort of tell a story about the history of philosophy, of modern philosophy at least, and he begins with Descartes, who he says basically invented the modern individual. And Descartes did this with his famous tweet, as Bard says, "I think, therefore I am." And this tweet caught on, right? And it's become the basis for really all modern ideologies, whether they be liberal, conservative, or not, socialist, or capitalist, or whatever. The individual and the freedom of the individual is really what all of our modern ideologies and social movements are trying to achieve. And I think that Bard is skeptical of this idea of the individual. Obviously, he's not skeptical that it exists. Clearly, the idea exists, and it's caught on, and it has shaped the course of the last 500 years of human history. But Bard will talk about neuroscience as though it's completely explained away the I, or at least the naive sense of the ego that we might have. And if he's talking about the naive sense of ego, then sure, I think that has been explained away by modern neuroscience, by our knowledge of the physiology of our bodies. But, there's a higher sense of individual that people like, Emerson, for example, who I'm reading a lot of lately, will talk about. Not the jiva, the small self, or what Kant called the empirical self, but the Atman, that divine self, that part of my own experience that is not my own, but belongs to God. The Christ in me, not me, but the Christ in me, as Paul put it. I think there is this higher sense that we can talk about, perhaps only poetically and mystically, but still we make reference to this higher sort of self that I think has not and cannot, in principle, be explained away by neuroscience. So Bard tells this story, right, and about beginning with Descartes and then moving on to Kant and Kant's interpretation of Newton's science, Newtonian science. Kant famously called himself, or his philosophy, a sort of Copernican revolution, and that prior to him there really hadn't even been any philosophy, since with Kant, with his Copernican revolution, in the same way that Copernicus, the astronomer, reoriented our perspective on the universe, and in fact inverted it, such that rather than thinking of the Earth and our view from Earth as the still point around which the whole world revolved, Copernicus threw the Earth into motion, thereby decentering the human subject and recentering us on the sun as the new still point of the center of the universe. Now, of course, Kant's inversion of this puts the subject back at the center of things, which is to say, Kant wanted to show that the universe that Copernicus and after him Newton said existed out there was in fact the projection of the human subject's own categories of thought and forms of intuition. In other words, the way that our organism is, what I guess designed, determines in advance, a priori, what it is that we can perceive and think about. So Kant's transcendental inversion of Copernicus's heliocentric system further individualizes the human being and throws us back in this sort of self-reflexive critical move onto our own subjectivity as something prior to anything we may come to know about the world out there, about nature. Now, I think Bard talks about this Kantian revolution as a turn towards mechanism, and I think to the extent that Kant made natural science, it made it such that natural science can only be founded on a kind of positivism. In other words, science can never tell us anything about the freedom of the human soul, even though science could tell us everything about the natural world out there, because of course for Kant, everything we can know about the natural world out there is already sort of pre-programmed in our minds. So whenever we think we discover something about nature, when the scientist thinks they discover something about nature, they're really just uncovering a prior law that had been at work in the formation of their own mind. So Kant is a kind of idealist in this sense, right? That he says that all knowledge is ultimately self-knowledge. Even what we think of as, what the scientist thinks of as knowledge of nature is knowledge of the self. But of course, I think what Bard is pointing to is a sort of practical effect of this Kantian move, is that people forgot the other half of the Kantian dualism because of the great successes of natural science and technology after Kant, that we got so distracted with the wonders of technoscience that we neglected the other half of Kant's dualism, right? We neglected freedom, we neglected politics and the need for free, rational individuals to together form communities of discourse that would move society forward away from, a kind of rule by force and towards a rule by law, intrinsic law, not imposed. I think this was ultimately called Kant's goal, when he would think of his utopia as a kind of cosmopolitical planetary society. And, there's still a lot there for us to think about and to strive towards even. But of course, the popular effect, the pragmatic effect of Kant's dualism was, as a result of natural science sort of mesmerizing us, is that we forgot about the soul, about the human dimension of things. And, the inheritance today of Kant is that, we think of our task as human subjects as one of having to overcome the world outside us through technological mastery, and thereby to achieve our own freedom from it. Because really, nature could only be an illusion if everything ultimately reduces the human subject. And, here I'm getting more into a sort of Hegelian interpretation of Kant, I suppose. But, this is the kind of story I think that Bard is telling us. And we could go back in time and offer a sort of counter-history of philosophy. And instead of focusing on Descartes and Kant and Newton, we could focus on other thinkers, early modern thinkers like Giordano Bruno, rather than Descartes, say. And Bruno's intuition of an infinite universe, wherein the human was only one of an infinite number of other intelligent creatures on other planets, right? So this notion of an infinity that extends into nature, or that exists in nature as nature, that you get from Bruno, I think undermines that Cartesian move, which would, end up too subjective and too inward focused and autistic. Bruno, I think, unlike Descartes and Kant, was actually, he lived his life and traveled and loved and lost. He was burnt at the stake for his political activities. So he's a worldly philosopher in a way that Descartes and Kant, and even Hegel, wasn't. So let's re-inherit our own modernity from another thinker like Bruno, and then when we get to the Kantian era, let's focus on a thinker like Friedrich Schelling instead of Kant and Hegel. He's usually backgrounded, right, just like Bruno. And if we think about Schelling's understanding, again, of an infinite nature that pre-exists and is the mother out of which human infinity, the inner infinity of the human mind emerges and is born out of. So nature is a priori for a thinker like Schelling. Let's re-inherit an alternative modernity from that idea and that method. Really, there's a creative method that follows from Schelling's metaphysics and his natural philosophy, and it's unlike that which would suppose that our ultimate purpose as human beings is to master nature through technology, through the application of technology. There's a receptive side to Schelling's philosophy, one that, yes, recognizes the freedom of human individuals, but also our duty as free human individuals to feel, to suffer what nature provides us with. In other words, to be receptive and passive just as much as we are to be active and free and creative. So, when I think about syntheism, what I started this video talking about, this idea that God is created by humans, or that God is to be created by humans at some future point, when the noosphere awakens to itself or the internet becomes conscious. While I think that there is something to that, I also want to make room for a more responsive, passive, sensitive kind of theism that would see that what we think we're creating as human beings, in fact, in some paradoxical way, is also what created us. And we have to situate ourselves in that paradox and not naively slide into one extreme or the other, because then I think we start to become incoherent. So, yeah, anyways, watch Alexander Bart's video. I'm going to go finish it. As I said, I'm only halfway through. I'll probably have more to say about it. So thanks for listening if you're interested in all this highfalutin nonsense.